Welcome to the course. My name is Gwen and I'm a software developer. Here is the itinerary for today. Part 1 will start in the browser to get a feel for the syntax, and Part 2 will be on a local computer building apps as you regularly would. Along the way, we'll cover different bits of the Vue API so you can get started right away. First, let's define what Vue is. On a basic level, it's a front-end library to help you build JavaScript applications. Now, Vue JS is more robust than something like jQuery since it gives you specific recommended patterns for code organization, although it did borrow a lot of good ideas from jQuery, Angular, React, and others. It's usually not found in the wild by itself. You'll see it used with lots of other libraries and combined to make sort of a framework and alternative to React, Angular, and others. And we'll cover many of these libraries today. So let's get straight into it. I'm here in my browser at jsfiddle.net. It's just another place to put front-end code. And I'm going to try Hello World. So this is, if I was just writing a plain HTML or jQuery application, I might put something like this. So how do I attach this to the Vue instance? Here, I've preloaded the Vue library, so I can just choose it from frameworks and extensions. I'm just pulling in the latest version. And from that library, I have a Vue instance. So I can instantiate it like this, and then pass it an object of options. The only required option I have to set is element. So which element in the DOM do I want to attach my Vue instance to? I'm going to attach it to root. And then of course I need to have a root, an element with the ID of root here. So now my Vue instance is attached to this div in the DOM. If I run it, of course it doesn't do anything different. So let's make it do something different. There's also a data object I can use, and I can populate this with variables to use in the DOM. So I can say data, greeting, hello Vue. Now, how do I put this in the DOM? Vue has something called double mustache syntax. And so anything inside of these double curly braces, Vue looks at and will parse as JavaScript. So Vue comes down here and says, okay, I have a variable in data called greeting, and so I'm going to render the contents of the variable. So we run this again, it changes to hello Vue. Another important concept in Vue is data binding. Vue uses two-way data binding through a directive called vModel. On an input, when I put vModel, it binds it to a variable in the data object that I give it. So in this case, I'm telling Vue to bind this value of the input to the greeting variable from data. If I run this, everything inside of my input is the same as the greeting variable, and then if I change it, it live updates. Extremely simple. vModel is something called a directive. There are a lot of directives in Vue, and they're used to interact with the DOM. Let's look at another common directive. vIf. vIf evaluates an expression to a Boolean value, either true or false. So let's start with something that we know is true. So if 1 equals 1, you're telling Vue to display this div and render it to the page. Yep. So this isn't so useful. It's usually used in combination with data attributes here. So let's make a new data variable. We're going to call it count. So if count equals 1, then display this div to the screen. So I'll put, let me change this to count equals 0. And of course it won't display to the screen. Now there are other directives that you can chain called v else if and v else, just like an if else statement. So let me change these to orange, just different values, red, oops, red, and let's say if count equals 2. So this is pretty self-explanatory. If count is 1, nope. If count is 2, render this. Anything other than that, render v else. So if I put 2, it's going to render red, and so on. Now, the thing to note about vif, these divs, if they're not true, they don't get rendered to the DOM at all. Now this might be the behavior you want, and many times it is. Vue also has another directive called vShow. So let's get rid of all this. vShow. And we'll just do the same thing. If count equals 1, and let's render green. Change count to 1, run, and it's green. Now, this time, if count is 2, of course nothing displays here, but it's actually still being rendered to the DOM, just with display none set in the CSS. So if you look in here, to kind of dig in, but you can see that there's a div with green inside, this our same div up here, and it's set to style display none. So it's still in the DOM here. And so sometimes you want to use vif and sometimes you want to use vShow. It depends on what you're doing in the application and if you need better performance if you're constantly adding and removing things from the DOM. So let's look at some more directives. I've already typed this out to save some time. It's just an input with a submit button. When you click it, it alerts, and also an email variable that is bound through the vModel directive to the what's entered into the input. So Vue has this directive called vbind. Now vbind can take an HTML attribute like disabled that works in vanilla HTML and parse it as JavaScript. So email.length we'll say is less than 2. So what this does is the regular HTML attribute disabled would disable this button, but we're telling Vue to parse this as JavaScript, so we're going to take the email length and the button will be disabled only if the email length is less than 2. If it's greater than 2, then the button will be enabled. So let's run this, and you can see I can't click on it, it's disabled, but if I type something here, now it's enabled again. So you can do this on many different attributes, not just disabled. And there's also a shorthand, which is what you'll usually see in Vue applications. So it will be just whatever HTML attribute preceded by a colon, and that's shortcut for saying vbind colon because it's so common in Vue. Now another use for vbind that's common is to dynamically add classes. So let's do colon, the shorthand for vbind, class, And then there's two different ways of doing it. I'm going to start with the first syntax, which is called object syntax. So I'm going to dynamically add this red class. And I'm going to say if the email.length is less than 2, I want to have a red border around this input box. So let me run that. And I have a red border. And as soon as I get past 2, or I get 2 or greater, then I don't. So that's how you can dynamically toggle classes. So there's another syntax used if you want to toggle in between two different classes, which is array syntax. So we can use just a regular JavaScript ternary here. So email.length is, let's say if it's less than 2, then we're going to use the class red, and if it's greater than or equal to 2, it will be the class green. So let me run this. And we have the class red, and now it toggles back and forth in between green. There are several other directives in Vue. These are a bit less common, but I just want to mention some of them. So we already know that we can put variables in the DOM using the double mustache syntax. If I run this, I can type and it shows up. I can actually do the same thing using a directive called vtext. Let me put a paragraph tag, vtext equals email, and then just close the tag. So if you're used to jQuery, you'll be used to the dot text that it uses to put text inside of an HTML element. This is doing the exact same thing. So if I run this, it does the same thing as using the double curly brace. There's also vHTML, which will parse it. It won't just put text inside, but it will parse it as HTML, similar to the .html in jQuery. So if I type stuff in, it does the exact same thing, but I can also type in HTML tags. And it parses it as HTML. So what if you want to render something just once as static HTML? Well, Vue has another directive called vonce. So let's say once, and put the email in here. Just to compare, I'm going to copy this and put it outside of the once. So let me start with something initially here. So as I update this, it only changes in the second one because it's frozen and just set as the static HTML of whatever it was initially. This second one will still display and update as you change the V model for that variable. So let's look at looping in Vue. I'm just going to clean this up real quick. Of all of this. And let's make a list. Unordered list with li. And the directive to handle looping in the DOM in Vue is called v_for. So let me come down here and get something to actually loop through, which is an array of cats I've already written. Paste it there. And the syntax for this will be, you need to take your array cats and you're gonna say item in items. So it will just be like a for in loop in JavaScript. So you'll say cat in cats, and then during every iteration of the loop, you'll have access to the cat variable, which will be per index in the array. So I'm just gonna put cat here and run this again. And it comes out with all the different cats in the array. So of course in the first iteration it displays an li element with the first cat inside, which is kitkat, at index 0, and then the loop moves to index 1 and then index 2 and so on and so on. And if you look in the dev tools, you can see it has the full array there. Now you can also do this with objects, of course. These are just simple objects with one key value pair each. So now cat would equal this object with the name inside. So to display the cat's name now, I have to do cat.name, run it, and I get all my cats. Great. So there's more we can do with looping, and there's more we'll get to later when we're looking at local applications, but that's pretty much how it works. So let's look at functions now. What if we wanted to add a new item to this array? So I'm just going to add something similar to what there was before with an input vModel equals new cat and a button. So I'll add a function to the button in a second. Add. Let me run this, and it renders my static HTML. That's good. And let me add this new cat. So this is modeling my new cat that I'm going to add to this list. So I need some kind of a function to add it for me. And I can do that with a directive called vOn on click. So when I click this button, I want it to perform an action. In this case, I want it to run the function add kitty, which we're about to make. So the data object is just for variables. So to put a function here, I need to add one called methods. And this is another object with functions inside. So add kitty. Oops, add kitty, which is a function and I'm going to need to push a cat onto this array to add it to this array. So I can access any data variable inside of a method by using this. So this dot cats will access my cats array in data here. So this dot cats dot push, and then I want to push my new cat. And my new cat I also have access to on this. So I can say this dot new cat, and I have the new cat's name. Of course, this would work if we had just a plain array, but we actually have an array of objects. So I'm gonna put this inside of an object and then say name is this dot new cat. So this will push another object onto this array. So let me see if this works. Ran it. Let me add, and I can't press enter right now, but when I click the button, it pushes onto my array. Perfect. Of course, it's kind of annoying to click add every time. So what if I want it to respond to an enter as I'm typing, so I can quickly add more kitties? I can actually add another event with vOn again, but in this case, I want vOn key up, and then equals add kitty. So I want to run the function add kitty on key up. So let's run this and see what it does. So Unfortunately though, I didn't tell it which key up, so any key that I press is just adding a new cat for each one, which isn't the functionality that I want. So I can modify this key up by saying key up dot enter. Let me run that. There we go. Key up dot enter. So I have to hit enter and it adds it to the array, which is perfect. Unfortunately, it's not really the functionality that we want to leave the same cat in the input box. So how do we clear the input box? We can just set new cat, this dot new cat equals an empty string. We've already pushed the new cat, so we don't need it anymore, and this dot new cat is fine to be emptied again. So let's run this. There. And now it empties, ready for more cats. So there's many more events and modifiers that you can chain onto events. For example, Vue has an API for chaining things onto the click event. You could do .prevent, which means prevent default, and you can also do stop for stop propagation. Basically all of the common things you might do that are associated with that type of event, which is super useful. I want to show one more shortcut here, and this is what you'll normally see in a Vue application. Instead of v on, because it's so commonly used, they have a shortcut to just do at. So at click, and then you can do this with any type of event. Anywhere you would use v on. So you can say at key up. Let me just show that this still works, and it works fine. Both ways work. This is just adding a shortcut to it. So let's say you want to update something that's rendering to the DOM. Vue has something called filters. So I'm just going to write a simple filter to illustrate what it does. And I'll come down here after methods. I can add another object, and this one is similar to methods. It's an object of functions, and I'm going to put the function capitalize. Function. And actually I need a value here. And I'll return the value, but I'm going to change it to uppercase. Oops. Vue will parse this as JavaScript with cat.name, and then it will pipe it to this capitalize function, which is a filter. So it doesn't change the actual value stored in the Vue state here in the data property. So all of these names will still be lowercase, but just the display on the DOM will be piped through this capitalize function, and it will come out value.to uppercase. So if we run this, so I actually misspelled filters here. I'm gonna add an S. And there you go. It filters through the capitalize. You can also pipe these. So I'm going to add one more. Kitify. And I'll make another filter here. Function value. And I'll return the value plus y. So run that, and it returns y on the end. If I piped it the other way, the y would be capitalized. Really, this isn't used that often in Vue, in my experience. It's just a good thing to know about for when the need arises. Another set of methods in Vue for updating what's seen on the DOM are the computed methods. So let me get rid of filters real quick. And this filters block here. Oops. And I'm going to add computed instead. Oops. Yeah. And I'm going to use the same, and scroll down. Oops. And I'm going to use the same method. So let's kidify the cat name function. This time the function doesn't have to take anything. So let's say if this dot new cat, which is our cat name that's entered in this input box. So if that, the length of that is greater than 1, I'm going to return this dot cat name plus y. And let's display this in the DOM. Kidify name. And I'll put a break after it. So you probably noticed the connection that Vue, whenever it sees a variable inside of the double curly braces, it looks down here at the data property and the methods and the filters and the computed and tries to find a match for it. So let's run this. There we go. And as I type, well, it's adding the y for computed, but it's coming up with undefined, and that's because I misspelled the variable. So let me put new cat there, run it again. Yeah, and that should work. So later on, you'll be using computed a lot when you deal with Vuex. It's also extremely useful if you have a lot of logic in the DOM. Let's say you were doing a lot of computation or updating inside of this block, then you could clean it up, take all of the logic outside of the DOM here, put it inside of a computed property, and then just display it in the DOM like we're doing. So let's say you want to update something that's rendering to the DOM. Vue has something called filters. So I'm just going to write a simple filter to illustrate what it does. And I'll come down here after methods. I can add another object, and this one is similar to methods. It's an object of functions, and I'm going to put the function capitalize. Function. And actually I need a value here. And I'll return the value, but I'm going to change it to uppercase. Oops. Vue will parse this as JavaScript with cat.name, and then it will pipe it to this capitalize function, which is a filter. So it doesn't change the actual value stored in the Vue state here in the data property. So all of these names will still be lowercase, but just the display on the DOM will be piped through this capitalize function, and it will come out value dot to uppercase. So if we run this, so I actually misspelled filters here. I'm gonna add an S, and there you go. It filters through the capitalize. You can also pipe these, so I'm going to add one more. Kidify, and I'll make another filter here. Function value, and I'll return the value plus y. So run that, and it returns y on the end. If I piped it the other way, the y would be capitalized. Really, this isn't used that often in Vue, in my experience. It's just a good thing to know about for when the need arises. Let's talk about custom components. Vue has a component architecture that lets you reuse bits of code, just like most modern single-page application frameworks. So let's illustrate this. I'm going to create a new component using vue.component, and I'm just going to call it cat list. And then I pass it an object of options. Pass it is a template, and I'm just going to do a multi-line string with, let's say for right now, and actually a list should be inside of UL. Now how does this work? Close this. I will have to attach it to my Vue instance. So I'm going to say component and then give an array of components. My component's name is cat list. Now let's add cat list to the DOM. So to add any custom component that you make, you can just add it by its name and run it, and you can see cat down here. You can also pass in logic and variables. So let's pass in our cats array and display the array through the component. The way to accept variables in a component is through something called props. I'm going to pass in the cats array. So I'm going to say props cats. Actually, this needs to be an array. Oops. And I'm going to pass in cats. And then here, I can use a v4 cat and cats. And then on display, it has to be cat.name. So here I actually have to pass in cats. So I'm passing in cats, but if you remember here, I have to add vbind, or the shortcut, which is just the colon. Because if I don't add that, it's just going to treat cats as a string when it gets passed into the component, instead of treating it as JavaScript and then looking in the data property and getting the array. So now cats is set to the array of cats, and if I run this again, it's the same array, and it adds on to both of them. So the idea of having components is that they're reusable modular pieces. And when you're developing Vue locally, Vue CLI creates a really nice project with you with a modular architecture that kind of handles this under the hood for you. To wrap up here, I just want to talk quickly about Vue lifecycle methods. Vue will trigger certain functions to run, which can be very useful when you're developing an application. So I have 4 functions here: created, mounted, updated, and destroyed, and they're just logging things. I'm going to run this. And if I look at the console, it shows created when the component is created, and when it's mounted to the DOM, it runs mounted. Now it's been updated because the state in the data object has been updated. Now for destroyed, it's a bit harder because in the small application, this instance never leaves the DOM or is destroyed. So I'm going to take a function to call destroy. So I'm basically setting a timer for 5 seconds, and after 5 seconds, it's going to call app.destroy because the Vue instance is set equal to the app variable. So this will destroy it. Let me run this again. So I see created, mounted, and then destroyed. This also means I won't be able to update anything here because it will be just statically rendered HTML as it is. It's no longer connected to Vue. There are many other functions that run, including before mounted, before destroyed, and I think they're very well drawn out in the Vue documentation, so vuejs.org, the version 2 guide. And if you look at the lifecycle diagram section, it shows you exactly when each function is going to be run during the lifecycle of the component. So this is a really good reference, and you'll be using these a lot as you develop applications. Next, we're going to go over how to start developing applications with Vue CLI locally. To create a Vue JS application, we're going to start with the command line interface. So if you come to cli.vuejs.org and click on Getting Started, over here on the left is a link for installation, and it prompts you to npm install-g Vue CLI globally. So if you copy this command and come over to your terminal, you can enter this and install Vue CLI. I've already done this, so I'm just going to check my version. My version's 3.1.1. So now I'm going to create a Vue app. And I can do this with the Vue create command. So Vue space create, and then whatever I want to name my application, which in this case I'm going to call it quiz. So it takes me through a series of prompts. Now if you'll notice, the last one manually selects, so you can select routing, testing, linting, etc. The default gives you just Babel and ESLint and is a pretty basic site. On top, this is a template I created, which I'm going to talk about how to do later. So for right now, we're just going to pick the default to get started and see how it works. It's installing all the dependencies. This will take a few minutes. And it creates a folder for you called quiz with your Vue application inside. And now it also tells me how to run the application. So I can move into the quiz folder, npm run serve, and it's going to run my Vue application on port 8080. I'm going to copy this, go to my browser, and it gives me a boilerplate application. Let's open up our application and see the code. I'm going to be opening up in VS Code, which is a free code editor. And you can see by default it gives you a few config files, package.json, which is where you reference all of the code that you didn't write, any third-party libraries. And then the meat of the application is in the source directory. And this is where your JS gets rendered, or your Vue gets rendered to the page. So you can see it's creating a new Vue instance just like we did before. The syntax is a little bit different, but it's doing the exact same thing. It's mounting it to a DOM element with the ID of app. If you're wondering where your HTML file is, it's in the public directory. You can see your index.html. And Vue is doing quite a few things under the hood that you can't see, so it auto-injects your script files, so it creates a bundle out of your main.js and all of these different Vue files. It bundles them all together, and then it injects a script into your HTML file for you. That's one of the really nice things about using Vue CLI. You have all of this boilerplate and setup done for you, like Webpack and Babel, so you can just start building right away. If you want to look at the Vue scripts, these are the different scripts that Vue is calling to run your application locally, or to build it for production, or to lint it for you. So let's look at the application. From the main.js, it's importing this app.vue file, which is the entry point of the Vue application. If you look at app.vue, you can see that it puts a template. This isn't created by Vue, this is part of the HTML5 standard, but it puts it in the same file with a script tag and also a style tag. How Vue works is when you're building an application locally, you create many different files, each with their own template tag containing your HTML, and then a script tag which contains the JavaScript that interacts with that HTML. So in that way you can divide up your application into components and then put them all together. They're all bundled into this main.js and rendered to the page. So here's the first project we're going to be building. It's a quiz application that keeps track of the number of total questions you have answered and the number you got correct. The questions are pulled in from an API and displayed along with the answers. The only user actions are to select an answer, click submit, and you also have the option of resetting the count of questions to 0. When you choose an incorrect answer, the color of the answer will turn red once you hit submit, and the correct answer will turn green. If you get it correct, it will only show the correct answer that you selected. Back in our quiz app, let's start making components. First, I'm going to delete this hello-world.view, which we will not need, and create 2 new components. Header.view and questionbox.view, which is where we'll display the question, answers, and the submit button. Inside of components, the only required element is to have a template tag for HTML. You don't really need a script tag or a style tag. So I'm just going to put some dummy text in here. Question box. And I'm going to copy this for the header component and just put header here. So the app component is still expecting hello world. So I'm going to put our new components in here instead. I'm going to say header and header. To be able to use the component in the template section, I need to add header here. Oops, comma, and then question box. And now I can get rid of the hello world and image, and I'm going to add the header here as well as the question box. Alright, let me run this. npm run serve. And in the browser we can see we have both components, a header and a question box. So before I update any of the components anymore, I'm going to install a third-party library called Bootstrap Vue. Bootstrap Vue has a lot of built-in components and CSS already written, so we don't have to worry about styling. If you're interested to see more, you can go to their docs or see all the components that they offer, like buttons, different form elements, and their rather nice layout and grid system, which we will be using. So to get started, I'm going to go back, get started, and copy this command. It wants me to npm install Vue, Bootstrap Vue, and Bootstrap. So I only need Bootstrap Vue and Bootstrap. I'm going to go ahead and copy it. Go to my terminal. Let me close this and get rid of Vue. Alright, now that that's installed, I can add it to my project. In my main JavaScript file, I'm going to import Vue and then call vue.use to add it to my application. So when you create Vue apps using the Vue CLI, this will be in the main.js file. You can add import bootstrap Vue. I like to do my relative dependencies last. And now I'm calling vue.use bootstrap Vue. Of course, this vue.use is just for the JavaScript portion of Bootstrap. So I'm also going to take the CSS and import it. Let me import Bootstrap CSS. And now I can start using these built-in Bootstrap components. So let's use Vue Bootstrap in the header component. I'm actually going to go over to the Vue Bootstrap docs and find the nav. And the header is not going to be a real nav in this application, but just for styling purposes, I'm going to go ahead and use this. I'm going to switch to 2 spaces here for consistency. Put a wrapper div in case I want to attach classes to it later. Also now I only want 2 items in here. I want to have the name of the application, which will be something like fancy quiz app, and then a counter for the number of correct versus total questions. So I'm just gonna hard code this for right now and replace these with variables once I have that part of the app working. So let me see how this looks. Let's run the app again. And now, now in the browser. Awesome. The only problem is these are links because it thinks it's or Vue Bootstrap thinks we're making a nav bar. So I'm just going to go ahead and disable these. Instead of active here, I'm going to put disable and disabled. And then for the logo, I just want to differentiate the style a little bit. So I'm going to make it bold. Also, to offset the header, I'm just going to add tabs here. And this should auto restart. Yeah, this auto restarts in here. So I'll go to my browser. Tabs added this line here. And then I have my logo and the counter. So the header component is done for right now. Let's move to the question box and go ahead and get that set up. So the question box is going to use another Vue Bootstrap component called the Jumbotron, which is basically a page element that sets itself out of the page like this. I'm actually going to copy this code with the enclosing div, switch back to my code editor, and paste it here. Just like before, I want to have 2 spaces. Indent here. Just a note, I always like to have this wrapper div around components because I like to make container classes for when I use Sass or CSS. So I would put something like question box container here and then reference this class to style this whole component. So this is a pretty plain Jumbotron. We'll see it in our app. And it's not exactly what we want because we want a question and then answers below it. So in the Jumbotron docs, we can actually use templates inside that will make the component look more like this. So I can put the question on top, then list the answers, and have the submit button at the bottom. And the submit button is another Vue Bootstrap element for buttons. Notice it's perfectly fine to have more templates inside of the parent template, which is your component. And you'll see libraries doing this using something called slots that we'll talk about later. But for right now, I'm just going to copy these, go back to my component, and I'm going to put this inside. So let's see what this looks like. Not too bad. I am going to remove the header because we already have a logo on the page and we just need to put the question here. So this will be our question. And then our list of answers will go somewhere here, as well as a submit button and a button once you've submitted to navigate to the next question. Let's see what that looks like. So we'll also have to get rid of these, which we don't want. Now let's see what this one looks like. Perfect. Question, list of answers, buttons. Now one more thing I want to do in Vue Bootstrap before I get to the JavaScript is set up a grid to kind of prevent these questions or the question box from going full screen. So layout and grid system, see the examples of how you can lay out a page with different containers in rows and columns. For this, I don't have different rows, so I'm just going to use the basic one here. Go back to my code editor, and I'm going to go to here, and I want this to wrap the question box component. So get rid of the extra 2 columns, enter, and then just copy this, paste, and then in this column I'm going to tell it, so on a small screen or anything larger than a small screen, I want to take up half the page, which is 6, because Bootstrap basically gives you 12 vertical columns, so if you want half the page you can do 6. Offset equals 3. And let me show you what this is doing. So I'll inspect element here. And the Jumbotron in the question box container is taking up 6 columns. So if I hover over this, you can kind of see that the yellow part is a 3-column offset from the left, and the extra white padding on the far left is from the container. So putting it inside a Bootstrap container just automatically centers an element on the page and gives it a little bit of padding on either side. So inside the container we have 12 columns. We're using 6 and offsetting by 3. Great, now let's jump into the API for the questions and start pulling some actual data for the application. OpenTDB.com is a quiz API that we can pull questions from. They give you a lot of nice options, like you can browse through questions, you can submit your own questions because these are all user submitted questions, and they also have a pretty nice API. By filling out this information, we can actually generate an API URL to pull questions from. So I think pulling 10 questions is good. Any category, I'm just going to select animals. Difficulty, any is fine. Any type, multiple choice, just so the UI is the same for every question. Default encoding is fine. So now it generates me this API URL. I'm going to go put it in my browser, and I can see every time I make a request to this API, it pulls 10 questions about animals. I think one kind of confusing thing with working with this API is that instead of putting all of these in one array, they put the correct answer separate from all of the incorrect answers, which is fine because we're just going to take the correct answer with the incorrect answers, write a function to shuffle them all together, and then match up the correct answer based off of what the user selects. And of course, every time you hit this API, it's going to come up with a different series of random questions that it pulls. Let's put the API in our application now. So I'm in my app component now, and I'm just going to add a function to pull in the questions and answers from the API. So if you remember when we were in the browser using JS Fiddle, we covered something called lifecycle methods, which are functions that get called automatically by Vue as components either get created or mounted or destroyed, etc. So we're going to use one called mounted here. It should be a function, and in it we're going to use the standard fetch API, which is a web standard and doesn't need a library to be imported. So I'm going to paste our questions API endpoint, and then I'm going to pass an object, an options object, with the method I want to get from this. Now that's all I really need, but I'm going to add a .then and take the response. So I'm going to say in the response, I'm going to use an arrow function here and say, let's console.log this response in JSON format, so JSON. All right, let's see what this does. Let's run this. By the way, don't mind any of this orange text. That's just which Git branch I'm on, and I'm trying to put different parts of this tutorial on different branches. I'm going to do npm run serve again. Nope, we have an error. I was just complaining that I'm using a console.log. This isn't a JavaScript error, it's a linting error. So I'm actually going to add this to my package.json. And all of my linting config is right here. So I'm going to add this as a rule here and say no console 0. Now let me try to rerun that. This is just for demo purposes. If I were actually building an application, I would probably want to have a warning or an error there, just so I would remember to remove all of those extra console.logs. Anyways, it's running now, so I'm going to check it out in the browser. Of course, nothing is different right now, but if I look in the console, let me refresh, and I'm actually getting a promise back, which is good. It means I'm getting the data back, but we can't see it right now because I have to update my promise chain. So let me go back to the code. In the app file, I'm just going to return this, return response.json, and I'm going to chain another .then. So I'll just say it's JSON data, and let me wrap this just so it's more clear. And then here is actually where I want to be able to access the data from my application. So I'm going to create, doesn't look like I have a data method yet, so I'm going to create a data function and add a comma. And I'm going to return an object. Oops. Object. Now if you notice, this is a little bit different from how we did it in the browser. The reason this is different has to do with some more complex features of JavaScript, so we're not going to talk about those, but it's basically required when you're making this type of single page application with a bunch of different components that instead of just making a data object, you return an object from within the data function. So it's a minor change. So here I want to add a questions array, which will be empty at first and can be populated from the questions from the API. So here I don't need to return anything, but I want to set the questions, this questions array, to equal the questions we get back from the API. So I'm going to set this dot questions equal to the data we get back from the API dot results. Because if you remember, the API gives us back two things. It gives us a response code and then a results array. And the results array is where all 10 of the questions we are pulling back are located. I can save this. My app's still running, so I'll test it in the browser. And you can't see it yet, so to inspect the data on our components, we actually need something called Vue JS DevTools. So if you Google Vue DevTools, this is the GitHub repo. If you scroll down, you can see they have a Chrome extension, a Firefox extension, which I'm using Firefox right now. If you're using something else or you just want a standalone app, that's fine too. They all have pretty much the same functionality. So I already have it installed and it comes up on my DevTools as Vue. One of the things I love about Vue is that it has all its DevTools in one place. We're going to get into Vuex and different things later. Some other libraries, you have different DevTools for different things that you're doing. So under app, I can see all of the components imported into app, the child components. I can also click on app and I can see any data variables associated with that component. Under questions, I can see we have all 10 questions that we pulled from the API, and it's in the same format that the API showed us, with the incorrect answers and then the single correct answer by itself. So the next step here is to display the question to the screen. So let's go back to our code. I'm back in the app component and I want to be able to display the question from this question box component. So I'm going to have to pass it from the app component to that one. And I want to pass just the question that we're on. So as you're clicking next through questions, I just want the question box component to know about the current question. So I'm going to keep an index of the question here, which will start at 0. And then Vue lets me pass data variables and methods to my child components by using vbind with custom attributes. So I can say the question I want to pass equals my questions array and the index. So just the current question that we're on. And then eventually we'll be able to click next and this index will increment. So question 1, question 2, etc. Now if you remember the structure of our data off of each question, so this is one question, this object. We have the correct answer, incorrect answer, and the question. So we have to get the question text off by using .question. So let's do that in the question box. So I'm going to come here and remember the double mustache syntax to use variables. So I'm going to do question, which is passed from the parent component, and then I have to do .question. So maybe it would be more clear if I did, let me change this to, I guess, current question to make it more clear. And then I have to go and change it in the parent component. There. So you can give this any name, but it's going to be the same name in the child. But that's not the only thing. In order for this question to display properly in the child component, we not only have to reference it in the HTML, but we have to pass it through the JavaScript. So I'm going to create a script tag here. And a regular exported object. And for now, I'm just going to give it the key props, which is another object. And I'll put current question, which is also an object data type that I receive from the parent. So any variables, whether it's a data property or a method that I'm passing from app to question, in order for it to display in the HTML, I have to reference it in props and say, hey, I'm receiving this particular named variable from the parent. And you reference it the same way you would a data variable. So you have your component state, which would be local to this component in data. So this is local to the app.view component. And then you can also have props, which is any variable passed from another component to this component. And you use them the exact same way in the HTML. So let's see if this is working. npm run serve again. So it built, and now let me check in my browser. There we go. And it's showing one of my animal questions, the 0 question. I can check this if I go down here into my Vue DevTools. I'm inspecting the question box component and looking at the props. I see I get the current question object, which has the question, a carnivorous animal eats flesh. The same thing we're seeing on the screen. And if I go to my app component, I can look at my index, which is 0. So if I edit this and say 1, then it actually changes the question that I'm passing to the question box component, because now it's at the first index instead of at the 0 index. So if I go back to question box, you can see the question is changed. So let's set up the navigation between questions, this next button, without having to go into the Vue DevTools to change the index. Back in my app.view component, after data, I'm going to create another object called methods. And in here, I want a method to increment my index value so I can navigate through the questions. So I'm going to call it next. It's a function. This is basically a shorthand syntax for having a key of next and a value as a function. But I can just write it like this in JavaScript. And in here, the only thing I want to do right now is take the index, which I can refer to as this.index in my method, and increment it by 1. So this dot index plus plus, and that will take the current value of this dot index in data and add 1 to it every time the next method is called. So I'm also going to want to pass the next method into the question box. So the same way I did with current question, I'm going to pass in the next function and then go to question box and receive it. Here in my next button, let me just spread this out. I'm going to add an @click method and then call the next function on click. And of course down here, I have to receive that prop. So I'll say next, which is also a function. So now when I click the next button, it should increment the value by 1 by calling the next function in app.view, and then app.view should pass down the next question in the list. So let's see if this works. Vue is still running, and let me go to the browser. So I have my 0 index right now, and something's not working correctly. It says current question is undefined at question box. So let me go in here and see it's still at index 0, of course, because we're getting an error. And here I have the next function and current question. So everything looks okay in our data. And I think we're not quite getting the best error message, so I'm going to check in another browser. Copy this, go to Chrome, and now I can check in the Chrome DevTools. And here it's saying cannot read property question of undefined. So let's go to the question box component and see what it's talking about. Oops. If you look in question box, it says cannot read property question of undefined. So that means current question is undefined, but when we look at the DevTools, it's defined. So that means for a brief moment, when this component is mounting, it's still waiting for the data to come from this component. And we can see that. I'm just going to add a lifecycle hook here. And I'm just going to console.log this current question. Then back in the browser, I'm going to refresh this. And it's undefined. But in the DevTools, it is defined. So that means right when the component mounts, it's still undefined, and it's a moment later when the questions come back from the server and it goes into the state in this component, and then it gets passed to the question box component. So an easy thing to do would be not to render the question box component until these questions are defined. So wait until we fetch the questions and save them in the component state until we render this component. So I'm going to add a vif directive, and I'm going to say vif questions.length. So if the array is empty, then the length will be 0, which is a falsy value. So the question box won't render. But as soon as the questions come back from the server, the question length will not be equal to 0. And so question.length will be truthy and question box will render. So let's see if this fixes the error. Refresh. Let me go to the console. And now there's no error. Of course, we're still getting our log. But it fixed the error because now for the brief moment in time, question box is not rendering without the data available to it. And now we are able to also navigate between questions just as we would expect with the next function, incrementing the index. Of course, there are still problems because when the index gets to 10, it'll throw an error because that's past the length of the questions array, and we'll fix that in a minute. Back in the question box component, let's add the list of answers here instead of the dummy text. So if you remember our data structure, had a list of the 3 incorrect answers and then the correct one separately. So to display all 4 answers, we just need to put the 4 answers together. So as a temporary solution, let's use a computed method. So I have an object of computed methods, and I'm going to call it answers. So I basically have to take current question from props and the array of incorrect answers, and I'm actually going to assign this to a new array. I'm going to say let answers equal current question dot incorrect answers, and what I'm doing here is making a copy of the array instead of referencing the same array. And now I'm going to need to take answers, this answers array, and append or push the correct answer onto the end. So I take current question dot correct answer and I push that onto the array. And of course this is the array that I want to return, so I'll just return that. So I should have all 4 of my answers in this array now. And for right now, I will just replace it in here with a v4. So I'm going to do v4 equals answer in answers, which is going to reference our computed answers. And here it's going to complain because for any v4 loop, I'm going to need a key attribute. So Vue requires this for accessing these elements in the DOM. So I can do a vbind key, and usually you want to do something unique. Here we kind of know all of the answer, or each answer is going to be unique. So each paragraph tag that is created in this for loop is going to have a unique key which will be equal to the answer. Usually if you're doing this in an actual application, you'll want to use some kind of unique identifier, or Vue also gives you the option here of getting the index in the array. So you could call it index and then use index here as your unique identifier. And I guess I'll just leave it like that for now. Now, if we were to look at this right now, we would see 4 empty paragraph tags. So I'm going to put the answer text inside with double curly braces. Save that. Now I'll test it in the browser. Go here, refresh. Looks like I'm getting an error. What error am I getting? Seems like a similar error to before. I'm getting current question is not defined. Oh, so I actually referenced current question incorrectly. If you look here, I'm referencing current question, but that's assuming that it would be an accessible variable. Actually, because it's a prop, I need to access it through this dot current question. And I'm going to have to do this dot current question dot correct answer as well. So this should fix the problem. And actually, anytime you want to access a prop or a data variable in another function, whether it's a method or computed or anything else, you have to do this dot the name of your variable. So I'll save that, see if that fixed it. And yes, it is fixed. These are just old errors, so I'll refresh. So it is fixed, but we're getting just the numbers of the answer and not the answer text. So there's actually another mistake here, and it was in how I returned answers. So I'm going to pre-push answers here, push the correct answer onto the array, and now I will return answers. And that should fix the problem. Yep, and now we're getting the correct looping through our answers, and they're all 4 displaying. If we go to the next, and it's displaying all our answers. Now we actually want this to look a bit more like a list and also make it clickable for the users. So I'm going to go to Vue Bootstrap again, Components, Bootstrap Vue, and I'm going to go down to, there should be a list group, here it is. And we want to display it like this. This will make it easy for a user to hover and click on an element. So this is pretty easy. I'm just going to copy this list group here, since this is exactly what I want it to look like. Go back to my code, And I'm going to paste the list group in here. These, tab them over, and I'll get rid of all except one. Now I want the list group on the outside, and I want to loop through and make a bunch of these items. I'm going to put this on another line, put this over, format it nice, and now I can copy paste the loop, v4 loop, and also copy this, and then put the answer inside instead of the dummy text. And that should work. Let me save that and see how it looks in the browser. Go here, and it works just fine. So I don't really like how the buttons and everything are rubbing up against each other and then up against the answers. So if I look in my dev tools, I can refer to these with the class list group or list group item. So I'm going to copy this class, go back to the application, and just add a style tag to the bottom. Any Vue component can have a style tag in it. And there are different options you can use for styling. I'm just going to use default CSS. You can also use Sass if you want to. I'm also going to denote that these styles are scoped, meaning they won't be global styles. They will only affect styling in this component. And I'm going to paste the class that I copied and say that for the list group, I want to have a margin, let's say margin bottom of 15 pixels. Save that, see how it looks. And there's a little bit of padding now. For the buttons, I'm going to put a sideways margin, and I'm going to reference these as btn from the button class. So I'll put margin, I'll just make the top and bottom 0, and then left and right, maybe I'll give it 5 pixels. Save that. And now it looks a little bit better spaced out. So now to make the buttons clickable, let's go back to the question box component. And I want to add an @click function here. So @click equals a new function I'm going to create called select answer. And I'm actually going to pass it the index of the answer that was selected. And I'll go down and create this function under methods and object and selected answer, and then I'm just going to log out the index here. Let me test this in the browser, see if it works, and it does. So I have the correct index of the answer I'm selecting. The next thing is to save the select index on the component. So I'm going to create a function here. Oops. And return an object of our data variables. And the first one I'm going to say is selected index. And for right now, I'll just set it to null. And now down here in the selected index method, I'm going to say this dot selected index equals index. And we can see this in the Vue DevTools. Go back to the browser. I'm going to refresh, go to the Vue DevTools. And in question box, I can see selected index is null. Okay, so I tried refreshing, and let me click again and again. And for some reason, the state here isn't updating, but if I hit refresh in my Vue DevTools, then the state updates to the correct number. And now if I click on this first one here and click refresh, now the state updates to 0. So for some reason, the Vue DevTools aren't updating, but our function is working correctly. There are still a few more steps to do to be able to get our answers working correctly. And first of all, there's no visual feedback to the user to let them know to first click on an answer or that they've selected an answer. So let's first create a hover style. And I'm going to go below here, copy this, and say list group item hover state. So when the user hovers over it, I want to just change the background color slightly. Right now the background on the answers is white, I believe. So let me change it to a shade of gray. If FFF is white, maybe I'll do EEE and see how that looks. Now when you hover over it, you can see that it's a clickable item. Another thing I should add is changing the cursor to a pointer. And now when I hover, I can see that I have this little clickable hand. Unfortunately, when I click, let me click on Neanderthals, and I still have to refresh this. It's selecting the index in the data, but the user has no feedback here as to which answer they've selected, or if the application's even working. So let's fix this by adding selected classes. Back in the code, I'm going to add 2 more classes here. One is for a selected answer, and I'm going to give this a background color. Let's just say blue for right now. Background color of blue, and then a correct answer. When the answer is correct, I'm going to give it a background color of green. And one more, when the answer is incorrect, I'll give it a background color of red. In order to add these classes into the code, we're going to use one of our data variables, selected index, which should be set to the user selected index when they click on an answer. And we need to add a vbind property here and bind a CSS class to this. So I'm going to put class equals, and then it's going to be an array. We're actually going to add things to this later on. But for right now, I'm just going to do selected index. If it equals index, then I'm going to use a ternary, and I'm going to say, let's give it the class selected, and if it's not, then we'll give it just an empty string, no class. I'll save this, and then in the browser, we try selecting a class, and it's not quite working. Let me look at the console. If I refresh, then it does work. Unfortunately, it's a really dark, ugly color. So let's just change it to maybe a light blue. Let me go down. Selected could be light blue. Let's do light green. Back in the browser. Now it looks much better. And then if we go next, of course, it's not clearing the answer, which is another bug we're going to have to fix. A second bug is that our answers aren't shuffled. So we actually know that every 4th answer here is the correct one. And then on top of that, our submit button doesn't do anything yet. So let's go back to the code and fix these 3 things, starting with the answer shuffling. To shuffle the answers for every single time that the question changes, I'm going to add something called a watch method here. It's just like computed or methods in that it takes an object of functions. And in this object, I can watch for changes to my props. It will run this function when it changes. So I'm actually going to give it the same name as my current question prop. And then when the current question changes from the parent, it's going to run this function where we will shuffle our answers every time. So the first thing I want to do in the function is to set this dot selected index back to null every time the question changes. And then I want to shuffle the answers. Dot shuffle answers. And shuffle answers is going to be another method that I create here. And I'm going to copy paste this answers array I was creating there. And here I'm going to put this dot current question dot correct answer. So I have them all in an array, all 4 answers. Now I could do this with a for loop and some randomization, but there's actually a really nice helper library that I can use for this to help me shuffle an array, and it's called Lodash. Lodash is a very popular JavaScript library that's full of useful utilities that might take you a while to write on your own and that are common in many projects, like having to shuffle an array. So I'm going to go to the Lodash GitHub. And right now we're just going to do npm I Lodash in the terminal. While that's installing, I'm going to go back to the browser, and we're going to be using a function called shuffle. In the root of the Lodash GitHub repo, you can see that every single utility function in the Lodash library is listed here as its own file. So I can actually go into Shuffle.js and see exactly how it works, what algorithm they're using for the shuffle. And if I wanted to, I could just borrow this one file and any files that it imports instead of importing the whole Lodash library. I think it's really nicely laid out in this fashion, and it's a very good learning experience if you want to look through some well-written algorithms in JavaScript. So it should be done installing. Let me go back to my server, npm run serve. And now back in my code, I'm going to add the Lodash library. I need another data property where I'm going to put shuffled answers. This is going to be an array, and I'm just going to call it shuffled answers. And here I'll put this dot shuffled answers equals. Now Lodash, the convention is to import it with an underscore and then use it instead of calling Lodash dot shuffle. I would import it as an underscore here. And so I'm going to do that at the top of the script file. Say import underscore from Lodash. Actually get rid of this mounted function, and I need to tell it what array I want shuffled, which in this case is the answers array. So I do have a typo here. Instead of saying current question, I'm saying correct question. Just going to fix that. Now if I look at the browser, then I'm going to refresh, and let's take a look. So right now we don't have any shuffled answers. Let's see if when we hit next, we actually get shuffled answers, which you can see bird is the first element of the array at the 0 index. In the regular answers, where we're just appending the correct answer onto the end. And then in the shuffled answers, bird is at the 2nd index. So we can see shuffling works. Unfortunately, it only works as we click through the questions. Also, we can check and see that selection works, and then it does reset after we click for the next question, which is good. Now, how do we get it to shuffle on the first question? There are actually 2 ways we can do this. Let me go back to the code. And the first way is something that you already know. We can add a mounted lifecycle hook just like we had before, and then we could call this dot shuffle answers from here. And that would work. That would shuffle answers on the first component mount, and then every time after that, when the current question is updated in props, it would shuffle the answers, which is fine. It gets the same functionality, but there's also another way that might be a little bit better. So I'm just going to show you. in these watch functions, instead of making them a function, you can make it an object and set some options on the object. So I'm just going to comment this out real quick and set it to an object. And one of the options we have is to set immediate to true. And then we can add a handler, which is another function. And then inside of this handler function, we can do the same things we were doing before, and it will be called like a regular watch function. So let me get rid of this. And now let's see if it does in fact update and shuffle the questions for the first question that is shown. Back in the browser, I'm going to refresh and then check and see if they are shuffled. And yes, this is great. We do have shuffled answers now. So just to reiterate, what immediate does is instead of only running this watch function when current question updates, it's going to also run it when current question first gets passed as props, and then every subsequent time that it updates, it will also run the handler function again. Here I'm going to update the submit button. I'm going to clean it up a little bit first, take away this href that we're not going to use, and then put it on separate lines because we're going to add a couple more things here. For right now, if you remember, there's the v-on directive, which I can attach to events like click. So v-on click. And then I want to run a function that I'm going to create called submit answer. And here I'm going to change this directive to use the shortcut. And now let's create the function submit answer here. Down in our methods, submit answer, and this will run whenever that button is clicked. And the first thing we want to do is store whether or not the answer is correct. So I'm going to create a variable, and by default I'm going to set it to false. And then if the user got the correct answer, I'll set it to true. So if this dot selected index equals the correct index, meaning they got the correct answer, then I'm going to set is correct to true. And with this is correct variable, I need to be able to tell the app component whether or not the user got it correct, and also let the app component know that the answer was submitted, because in the header we have a counter of the correct answers versus the total answers, and this information will have to come from question box through the app component and passed as props to the header. So let me create a new prop from the app, and it's going to be this dot increment, and I'm going to pass whether or not the user got the answer correct. So is correct, and I'm going to go ahead and add this as a prop here. Its increment is going to be a function. And now from the parent component, I need to actually add this function. So let me go ahead and pass it down, and I have to create the function. In methods, add the increment function with the is correct boolean. And here I need to keep track of two things: the number of total user submissions for answers, and also the total number that are correct. So first I'm going to check if it's correct. So if is correct, I'm going to increment a new data variable for the number of correct. So up here in data, I'll go ahead and add these. So let's say the number of correct answers set to 0, and the number of total answers that the user has answered also set to 0 to start. And down here, I can say the number of correct, increment that number by 1, and then the number of total, I'll also increment that number by 1. And I forgot that this here. So this dot number correct increment by 1, this dot total increment by 1, and I want to do one more thing here, and that's pass these two values to the header component to use. So I'll add it here. I'll use vbind and pass the number of correct and also the num total. Now in the header to receive these props, I'm going to create the script tag, script, and export an object with props. And I'm going to do props as an array this time, just to have both different ways. And I'm receiving the number of correct answers from the parent as well as the number of total answers. And I can put them here with double curly braces. So the number of correct out of the number of total. Now we changed a lot of things. Let's look in the browser and see if this works. Let's see what it's complaining about. It seems to be okay right now. I'm going to select an answer, click submit, click next. Now I'm wondering why it's not incrementing num correct, num total. And it seems to only be incrementing the number of correct. So let's look back in the code and see why the total number is not incrementing. So we have the num total as props. That should be fine. Let's look in app. Num total is getting passed. We have num total here. And here I'm just doing total. So I'm going to put num total and that should fix the problem. Let me refresh just in case. Click on an answer, submit, and now my num total is incrementing. Although we shouldn't be able to submit a question more than once, because right now there's nothing stopping us from continuously submitting or even submitting before we have selected anything. So really we should be disabling this submit button until we make a selection. So let's go ahead and do that. And I want it to set as disabled if they have not answered the question yet. So I'm going to do vbind and then the HTML attribute of disabled. And I want this to be true if they haven't answered the question yet, and false if they have already answered it, and then the button will work. So I can use one of our data variables, selected index, because it will be null until they've selected an answer. So I'm going to say selected index equals null. And let's look in the browser and see if that works now. So it is disabled. I can't click on it right now. But when I select an answer, it gets brighter, darker blue. And now when I hover over it, you can see the hand, and now it selects correctly. And if I scroll up, it will still be incrementing 2 out of 7. Great. Now let's work on not being able to submit the answer multiple times like we can right now. What we are doing here, just checking if the selected index is null, only accounts for the case where the user has not answered the question yet. So we are going to have to add another check to see if the question has already been answered, and if it has, then also disable this. So I'm going to add another data variable called just answered and set this equal to false. And then up here, I'm going to say and answered. So as long as both of these conditions are met. And now I'm going to have to add these to some functions down here. In the submit answer function, I want to set this dot is, or this dot answered equal to true, because they've already answered the question if this function is running. And then in my watch handler, I also want to reset this dot answered as false for every question. I think actually in the button, I think I'm actually going to have to do an or here. So if it's null, they haven't selected an answer at all, or if it already has been answered in either one of these cases, it should be disabled. Let me save that and then go to the browser, just refresh, and then see my button is disabled. It's probably not a very good color for a disabled button, but oh well. And now it's enabled, and now I submit, and now it's disabled again after I submit. And it counted up, and I got the incorrect answer. Now, it would be kind of nice to see which one is the correct answer, because I know I got it incorrect because of this counter, but I don't really know which one of the other three was the correct answer, and I can't submit it again. So let's change that in the styles. Jumping back into the code, let's store the correct answer. If I scroll down to my data, I'm going to add another variable called correct index, and I'll set that equal to null initially. And now when I shuffle my answers, meaning when I get a new question, I'm going to store which one of the answers is correct. So I'll go down to my shuffle answers function, and I'll say this dot correct index equals this dot shuffled answers. Inside the shuffled answers array, I want to get the index of the correct answer after it's shuffled. So I'm going to use the JavaScript property index of on the array, and then I'm going to say it's the index of whatever the correct answer is. So I already have the correct answer stored in this dot current question dot correct answer. So now this should keep the correct answer so we still know it, even though all the answers are shuffled together. So let's see if this is working. Go to the browser, refresh, and now look at my question box, and I have, well, that's interesting. I must have made a mistake in typing this out. Let me go and check the code and see what I did. I actually misspelled shuffled answers. I left off the S, so now I'm going to save this, go back to the browser again, and it shows the correct index. Let me go to the next question, and the correct index changes per question. Unfortunately, as a user, how do I know if what I selected was correct? There's no way for me to know. It just moves on to the next question. So let's add some functionality and styling so the user can see feedback that the answer is correct or not. And in doing this, we'll need to make the submit button work as well. If you remember a while back, we made these different CSS classes, selected, correct, and incorrect. And so far, we've only used the first one, so let's use the other two. We show the correct answer as green after they hit submit, and if they selected the incorrect answer, then that's going to turn from light blue to red. So we're actually going to make a dynamic class, and here I'm going to put this on a separate line, because I'm going to be adding some stuff just for the time being here. We actually only want this selected class to appear if the question is not yet answered. So I'm going to add a not answered here and selected index. And just for a second, I'm going to be nesting ternary statements here, and then I'll clean it up after. So right now we have the case where it's not answered and they've selected a choice. So what about if that case is not correct? So here I'm going to add a case if it's answered and the correct index equals index. In that case, they got it correct. We want to show it as correct. And I believe that's the name of our class here. Yeah, correct. And otherwise, we can show it as nothing. So let me save that and see how it's working so far. Yep, so that's the correct answer. And now it shows the correct answer there. So there's going to be another case that we have to add here after here. So I'm going to copy this actually. And if it's not equal to index, I'm going to say we're going to use the incorrect class. Otherwise, no class. So if it's answered and they didn't get the correct answer, then I want it to turn red. So let's see if that works. Obviously, it didn't work that well because every incorrect answer is turning red. And I just want the user selected one to turn red. So back in the code, I'm going to have to add one more check into this chain. And that will be if selected index equals index. And this is getting kind of long. And back in the browser, let me refresh. There, and now it correctly shows. Of course, this logic that I wrote is kind of out of hand, and it's definitely messy to do all of this inside of a class. Just to clean this up, we're going to move all of these nested ternaries into a method. And we'll call that method answer class. And we'll pass it the index. Each list group item that's created, so each answer is going to call this method in order to see what class it's going to have. So I'll go down to methods and add this one onto the end. Answer class. It's going to be passed the index of the answer. And then just for reference, these are all the nested ternaries I had up there. I'm going to copy the first one. And first I need to create a variable called answer class and set that equal to an empty string. I have an if statement, so if it's not answered but they've selected an answer, then I'm going to set answer class equal to selected. And I'll just change some else ifs here. And if it's answered and they got the answer is the correct answer, then the class for that particular answer is going to be correct. And then a final case is if the user answered the question, but they got it incorrect, and we want to make that red with the incorrect class. So it would be answer class equals incorrect. And then down here, I'm going to return answer class. So let me clean this up. And let's see if that still works. Yes, so the answered is not defined. And that's because, again, I forgot to put this dot answered. So remember, in the template, you can use any of these variables, but if you're referencing them in the JavaScript, you have to reference them as this dot. So this dot correct answer, this dot answered, and this dot selected index, and this dot correct index. So this is kind of long. I'm going to put this on a few lines. And that should work. So let me try it in the browser again. Seems to be working. It's selected correctly. Now I can submit, and I got it wrong, so it's red and green. Try one more question. I submit. Yep, it works perfectly. Our counter's still working. This is the whole quiz application. The GitHub code will be linked below if you want to take a look. and you can see that there are different branches, so you could look at different parts of the tutorial in different stages if you wanted to. Now we're going to build an app that's slightly more complicated to demonstrate how Vue routing and Vuex, which is Vue's state management system, work. It's going to be a basic 4-screen application. Its theme is getting cats and dogs to be adopted, and we're going to be performing basic CRUD operations to get used to state management. Now there's a home screen, 2 screens, one for cats and one for dogs, and then you can click on any animal name, either cat or dog, and it will load a screen just for that animal. So here in the terminal, I'm going to create another Vue application using Vue create, and I'm going to call it adopt pets. Now if you remember last time, we used the default boilerplate. This time we're going to manually select features. To manually select, you can go up and down with the arrow keys and press spacebar. Such as here, I want to select router, so I press spacebar. I also want Vuex. If I wanted to use Sass or something, I would select this one. And then I think I'm going to leave testing out of this particular application. So that's all I want. I'm going to hit enter. And then it asks me a few other questions. History mode for router is literally a 1-line change in the router, and I'm going to show you how that works later. For right now, I'm just going to put yes. I'm going to pick Sass since it's the most popular CSS preprocessor, and I want to show you how I include it in my applications. For this, I'm just going to put standard config, although Prettier and Airbnb have some nice features as well. Either way, all of these are just templates and starting points, so you can always modify any rules that any of these set for you. I'm just going to have it run linting every time I save a file. And this is a personal preference of mine. I like to have my configuration in their own files, such as my unit testing config, Babel config, or my ESLint file by itself instead of cluttering up the package.json. That can get pretty unwieldy. Now, if I want to save it as a preset for future projects, I can type Y and it's going to ask me to give it a name. But I'm just going to type no here and then show you the one I already have. And now it takes a few minutes to build the project. Great, it's done installing. I'm going to go into the adopt pets directory and open this in VS Code. This is very similar to the project last time, still have the index.html in public. A few differences here are that in the main.js, instead of only rendering the app, we're setting our store for Vuex as well as our Vue router configuration in our Vue options. Another difference is you'll notice that here we have a views directory and a components directory. Now, if you look in the router, you'll notice that home and about, which are the 2 routes, are both views. So these are the pages of your applications which are connected to the router. And components are imported into the views or into each other. So if I look in home, I can see it's importing the hello world component, hello-world.vue, and it's displaying it to the DOM. The idea is that components are reusable pieces and each page stands alone as a distinct view in your application. Now, if I go back to the router, there's a lot of things you can do, such as lazy loading or even using multiple components here, but I'm going to keep it simple for now. So I'm going to take this out of here and import, and now I can set component to just about and get rid of all these comments. And now it renders exactly the same. It's just a bit easier to read right now. Now the store, I'm just going to give a quick overview and I'll go in deeper. You're basically creating a new Vuex store, which is a global object. So any functions or variables, data, anything that you want to use maybe in multiple parts of your application, you can store them all here and then import them into whatever component you want. And it's like a global object for your application. The first thing I want to do in this app is create the 4 pages and link them together. If I look in views, I have About and Home. I'm going to go ahead and leave the Home component and delete the About one. And then create one called cats.view, dogs.view, and the other one I'm just going to call pet.view. And I'll put a boilerplate template here. And I'll do the same thing for dogs. Put just the template here and one for the pet page. And now I'm going to hook these up to the router. Now I've defined all 4 routes that I'm going to use in this application. I'm going to update my app file to link to all 4 of those pages instead of just Home and About. Duplicate those, and now I'll put cats, dogs, and the pet page, which eventually is going to be linked through these 2 pages, but I'll just leave it for now. Dogs and cats. And let's see how that looks. Okay, it has all of the links here. You can go to the different pages. I'm just going to add this pipe in between. Copy this. There, looks much better. Now let me get rid of all this extra stuff on that page, which is in the Home component, importing Hello World and using this image. I'm just going to get rid of both of these and just say Home. Get rid of this and this. And now I'll delete the Hello World component. Perfect. Now, just like before, I want to import Vue Bootstrap to help do the styling for me and lay out the pages. I'm going to go to the browser, Vue Bootstrap, get started, install it with npm. So stop my server and npm I bootstrap Vue. Now back in my browser, I can copy the import in vue.use and I'll put it in my main.js file. I'll put it up here with my other library imports, and since I don't have a section for vue.use, I'll put it right there. Now I need to import the CSS as well. So I'll go and grab these links and put them here. And that's it. Now that I'm importing Vue Bootstrap, I'm going to use some of their table components to display the tables of cats and dogs. So if I scroll down here, see they have table. And this table looks fine to me. So I'm going to copy this B table and save it and go back to my code. And let me close some of these. Now let me start with cats. And here I'm going to add that table component. And now of course I need the data, so I'll add a script tag and close it and export default this object, data function, and return an object. And now back in the browser, I'm You can see I need an array of objects, which I already have in another file, and I'm just going to copy paste that into my application. So I'll create another folder in source, and I'm just going to call it data. And in data, I'm going to make two files, one file cats.js, and the other one will be dogs.js. And I'm going to copy and paste data that I already have here. Here are my dogs. This is an array of dogs. So I'll do export default this array. And I have some different information and metadata about the dogs. And let me close this one. And now I'll add my cats, which is also a very similar array. I'm going to add them here. And now back in my cats.vue, I'm going to import cats from at data/cats. Now this @ symbol is a shortcut that Vue CLI sets up for you, and it's a reference to the source directory. So that way you don't have to do things like ... /... and whatnot. So I'm just going to use the shortcut @, and now I'm going to return cats here. So this is the same, if you don't know the shortcut, this is the same as setting a cat's value equal to this cats array that we're importing. But the shorthand is just to do it like this, since they both have the same name. So now for items, I'm going to say cats here, and I'll see how that looks in the browser. Back in Firefox, if I go to adopt pets and refresh, I must have stopped my server. Let me look back at iterm, and yes, I did. So let me run npm run serve again. Great. Now my browser. All right, it's working. And now I have a cats table showing all of my cats. I'm just going to clean this up a little bit so it doesn't go all the way to the edges of the page here. And I'm going to add a B container in my app.vue. So for this router link, I'm going to wrap it in B container, which is another Bootstrap component provided by Vue Bootstrap. And I'll go back to the browser, refresh, and that looks much better as far as the width. I also need a page title, so let me create that real quick. Back in cats, I'm going to have an H1 here and say this is just cats for adoption. All right, that's good. Not too fancy, but looks fine. Now I'm going to copy paste this and do the same thing for the dogs tab. And I'll go back here, go to dogs. I'm going to copy paste this table. And the script tag. And then I just need to change it to dogs. Oops. Here as well, and here. Great, so those two pages are looking good. Just to finish up the home page, I'm going to change this to an H1 as well. And I'm going to say adopt a new best friend, H1. So that's all of the nitty-gritty out of the way. Now, if I go back to my browser, you can see that I have these 3 pages, but this page is supposed to be that of an individual cat or dog, kind of like seeing his individual profile. So if I go to cats, for example, then the pet page should be something like cat/1 for the ID of that cat. So let's learn how to do this through the Vue router. Vue router has something called dynamic route matching. What it does, instead of hard coding the whole route, you actually have a dynamic route variable as part of the route. It's preceded by a colon, and then you can call the variable whatever you'd like. And then you can access this variable when you go to that route in the component associated with the route on the route params object. So let's see what this would look like in our pet component. First, I'm going to update the router and say here under pets, I'm going to change it to be plural pets and /ID for the pet ID. And I'm going to leave these as they are for right now. Now let me get rid of the link in the app.vue file to pets. Let me just get rid of that. And now we need our table components to have links to the pets page for every item. So we'll have to update this table since right now it's kind of a black box and we're passing in this array of cats to a third-party Bootstrap component. So let's go to the Bootstrap docs and see how we can turn each cat in the table into a link to that page. So I'll go to the browser and I'm still under the Bootstrap component tables. This whole page is pretty big, so I've skipped down to this formatter callback. And basically what it allows you to do is pass in a template with a dynamic href. So let's copy this and go back to the code. I'm going to expand this, close it here, and put this inside. Now I want to mention something about slots because you're probably going to see this a lot in Vue, especially if you are using third-party libraries like Vue Bootstrap, or if you are creating your own components for someone else to use. Now, in Bootstrap's btable component, it's going to look something like... My formatter doesn't like this very much. So it's going to look like template and then have something exactly like what we have with maybe a div inside. And it's going to have a bunch of other tags and it will have this somewhere, slot. So Bootstrap is basically telling the component where to put things that we pass in to this btable. So it has different slots inside, and if it has multiple slots, which in this case it does, it will say name equals name, which will be dynamic because we have lots of different columns that could vary in the table. So Bootstrap will have a slot for each of our columns, and that's how we can pass it in here. If you want to know more about slots, they're pretty easy and they're described really well in the Vue documentation. And here I'm just going to replace this with /pets/variable data.value. And I'm going to change this to a router link, not use an a tag too. Router link, and I forgot link here. Let me do link. You can use an a tag. I think it's a little better and more consistent to use a router link. So let me go to the browser and refresh. And now I have links for all of these. Now I don't really want it to have the pet's name. I want the ID. So let me go back and change it. And instead of data.value, which will give me the name of the pet, I'm going to do data.index, which will give me the index of the row in the array. So let me go back to the browser and try this. And now let me go home. Now if I go and hover over it, I can see the link gives me the index. And if I go here, you can see in the URL I have pet/0, which is the ID of the pet in the array. So now I want to populate this page with the details on the individual pet. So what I could do is take these pets arrays and import them into my pet component and then get the index off of the router variable and just look in the array in this component. But I'm actually going to put all of the pets, dogs and cats in state and then pull the pet I want from state. So let me go to the store. And this is a very small project, so I don't need to do this, but I just want to show you how I generally set this up. I make a new folder called store, and in store I make a separate file for everything. So I'll have a file for state.js and one for mutations.js and then one for actions.js. And now I'll make an index file to tie these together, index.js. And I'm going to take what's in store right now, take all of this, copy it, put it in the index file, and now I'm going to import the other three files. So import state from state, import mutations from mutations, import actions from actions, and now I can use the shortcut here and here. Oops, get rid of this object and get rid of that. And now of course I need these to be actual objects in each file. I'll just, for some of these, export a blank object for now. The same thing in mutations, save this, and now in state I'll have a blank object, but I'm also going to be importing the cat and dog data. So I'm going to import cats from up a directory data / cats, and I'll do the same thing for dogs. Oops, dogs and dogs. And now on state, now this object is the default state of my application, so it's the data that I'm going to be able to pull into any component that I want. So for right now, I will have these separate. I'm going to do cats and dogs as separate arrays on my state. And now what I can do with this is go into my cats.vue, and instead of importing cats from here, I'm actually going to import something from Vuex called map state from Vuex. And down here, I'm going to use a computed object, computed. And the syntax for map state is to use a spread operator and call the function and pass it an array of the items on state you would like to be able to access from this component. So here I want to access cats from state, so I won't actually need this in my data anymore, and I'm going to get rid of it. So now I can get it directly from my Vuex store. I'll get this array. So let me go to the browser and make sure that's working. Go home, refresh. Now let me go to cats. And it's not working, so I must have an error. Let me see what error I have. None here. Let me go to the terminal. Now that looks good, so let's check the dev tools and see if we have a problem with our data there. And in my Vue dev tools, I can see cats is undefined. So let me see why it's undefined. If I go to my VS Code, it seems like I am mapping the state correctly from Vuex. So let me look and see if it's in the Vuex dev tools maybe. Vuex. And in my base state, I don't have anything in my base state. So let me see why nothing is in my state. If I go back to VS Code, so I'm pulling in the store from here. So I think the only thing I'll have to do here is just delete this old file, because now it should look at the relative path store, which is now a directory. And since I'm not specifying a file, it's going to look for the index.js file, and I'm exporting as default the store from there. So let me go back to the browser and I'll refresh. Great. now it's working and I'm getting the appropriate pets. So now I'm going to do the same thing for dogs. So I'm going to take this, actually the whole computed here, and go to dogs, and I'm going to add the computed object here. And I also need map state to connect the Vue X state from the store to this component. And I'm going to map dogs here. And I'll get rid of dogs in data. Perfect. So now how do I figure out whether it's a dog or a cat in the pets component? I could set this up a few different ways, but for right now, I'm just going to put /cats here, and I'm going to turn this into another variable. And because this isn't in my dogs component, I'm going to copy all of this and come back to dogs instead of the end here. I think I missed the template. Oh yeah, that's actually important. So I'll come back, do this, and I'm gonna close the table here. And I just need to change this to dogs. Now in my router, I'm going to have to change this to store the species and then the ID. Let me just make sure that's working. Back in the browser. Now, if I click on one of these, it takes me to the species and then the ID. And now I can access these from my component. So back in my pet component, I'm going to say this dot route. Actually, because I'm in the template, I don't need this. So I'll just say route dot, I believe it's params dot species, and then duplicate this row and dot ID. Let me see if that works. So I'm back in Firefox, and it does work. Add the species and the ID. Now a quick way for me to get to the right cat in this component is to pull in the cats and dogs from state, because this component is its own view and it's not connected to cats or dogs. So I'm going to copy the script tag here and then modify it. I have map state, which I want, and I'm going to add dogs here so I can listen to cats and dogs from here. And I just want to mention real quick that you could do this same thing by saying cats, adding as a method here, and then returning something like this dot store dot state dot cats. And this is actually the same thing as doing map state here, but you're never going to see this in an application. This is pretty much the standard syntax. It's shorthand and it's easier to do because sometimes you have a lot of elements on state, and it's much easier to just use the map state method. And now I have access to these in my DOM. So what I want to do is find out if it's a cat or a dog, and then display the information here. So I'm going to make a method for this real quick. Methods object, I'm going to call it pet. And inside of pet, I'm going to check for first the species. So I'm going to say that animals equals, actually I need this here, this dot route.params dot species, and now this will either return cats or dogs, and so I want to access it on my this object, so I'm actually going to pass it in as a variable. If this is confusing to you, then it's the exact same thing as accessing these arrays off of state. So I could do this.cats or this.dogs, but I can also use the bracket syntax and pass in a variable here. So I could pass in this.cats, which is exactly what I'm doing right here. Get rid of that. And now I have my animals here. And on my animals, I want to see which animal I want to display. I'm just using an index right now, so it's easy. If I was using an ID, then I would have to search through the array and find the animal with the correct ID. So for right now, I suppose I'll just say animal and then pass the index of the animal, which will be route.params.id. So I can do this.route.params.id here, and that should get the correct animal. And now I'm going to return that animal, and I should be able to use it in my DOM. So let me see if this works, and instead of all of this, I'm just going to have animal.name. Go back to my browser, see if I don't have any errors, but I do. Oh yes, property or method animal is not defined, of course, because I called it the wrong thing. So the method is called pet, so I actually have to get rid of animal here, and I'm calling it pet, and then I'm returning animal from here. So this should return the correct animal's name. And let me check it back out in the browser. And great. So now if I click on, let's say, KitKat, it shows up with the correct name. Of course, this is a little bit messy, and I don't want to be calling the method every single time I want a property off of this animal. So what I can do is in data, I can put animal and set it equal to an empty object. And then here, instead of methods, what I could do is put a lifecycle method here. So I can say, for example, when the component is mounted, get rid of this. And now I can set this.animal equal to animal, which will set animal on my data object. And then up here, I will be able to access animal.name. And let me wrap animal.name in an H1. Let me close my H1. And I'm going to add the animal's age here as well. So animal.age, close the p tag. And I think I have a breed property, so let me just add that one real quick too. So animal.breed. Now I'll go back to the browser. Awesome. So these are old errors. I can just ignore them. Now I have the name of my pet, the age in years, and then the breed. And this works if I have dogs as well. Now I could probably put something to denote whether it's a cat or a dog here. So I think I should take this species, and I'm going to add that in here, and I'll put it inside parentheses. And then I also want a label for the animal's age, so years old. And for breed, I'm going to put this. I should have this here too for age. So I can put that here, and that should look a lot nicer. And now when I go here, I can see I have labels on these, and I can now see if it's a cat or a dog. Great, so another thing we probably want to do is be able to edit these animals to add CRUD operations, and that will lead into how to use actions and mutations in the store. So let's jump back into Vuex. Let's start by adding the functionality to be able to add a pet. To do this, we're going to have to append the new pet to the array in store, to one of the arrays. Now the pattern that you'll generally see for doing this is definitely not updating state directly, because that's what mutations are for. Mutations are there to update state for you. And generally speaking, you will call an action that calls a mutation which updates state. And a lot of the time, the actions that you call will be where you're also making API calls because they're asynchronous. So we're just going to use that pattern of using actions that call mutations that update state. So in actions, I'm going to add an add pet method. And Vue gives me a context object here. And then I can use an argument when I call this function. And I'm just going to call that pet for right now. Make this an arrow function. And with context here, it has a commit method on it. So I can use commit. And now this will call a mutation for me. So I'm going to need to create a new mutation. And I'm going to call it append pet. And I'm going to append the pet with my new pet object that's going to be passed into this function. I want to make a note here that this is generally not how you will see this being used, because context, you only need the commit method off of it. So you can actually pull that directly off the object here. And this is generally how you will see commit being used. And remember, this object comes from Vuex, and this pet is the custom parameter that we're going to be passing into the function. Now I'm going to copy this name, append pet, and go into mutations, and I'm going to add a mutation called append pet. Here again, we have two parameters. So the first that Vuex gives us is state. So we have the application state. And then the second is whatever payload we're passing into this function. So that would be pet here. And I'm going to make this an arrow function again. And from here we can mutate or update state. So I'm going to say, so state dot whatever species, which is an array, so I can actually push the new pet onto that array. To do this, of course, I'm going to have to pass species into this with pet. So here, I'm going to change this so that I'm passing in an object with pet and also the species of the pet. So for shorthand, and because I'm just passing this straight through, I'm just going to call it my payload, which will have payload.pet and payload.species. And I can pass this payload directly into my append pet mutation. And from here, I can destructure this and say species and pet and state.species, which will be cat or dog, and I'll push the new pet onto that. And that should append to either our cats or dogs arrays. So I'm going to do this for cats and dogs at the same time. So I'm going to go to home and add a button here with a bootstrap class of btn, and I think btn primary to give it some color. I'm going to say add new pet, and this should toggle an add new pet form. And now in my JavaScript, I'm going to add a methods object and say toggle pet form, and this dot pet form equals the opposite of this dot pet form. And of course this is going to be a Boolean, so I also need to add a data method and return an object of my data variables, and one of them of course will be pet form. Maybe to be more explicit, I should say show pet form, so it's obvious that it's a Boolean. And to start off with, I don't want to show this pet form, so I'm going to say it's false, and then every time that this method is called, it will toggle the form from showing. So now we actually need the form, and for that I'm going to copy a Vue bootstrap form, and I'm just going to take this most basic form at the top and then modify it. So I'll come down here and copy everything in B form, go up, B form, and now back to the code. I'm going to add that form here. That looks good. And I have to, of course, update all of these functions because it's not going to run right now. So get rid of @reset, which I'm not going to use. Now show pet form. So it will show this pet form if this variable is true. So this button will toggle it. And I'm going to make a handle submit function for when the user submits this form, which will eventually call our action. Right here, I'll add the handle submit function. And for right now, it's not going to do anything. So let me just fix the rest of my form real quick. We want the pet's name first and foremost. We don't need an email address for the pet. So I'll get rid of that one. And now this example input group, I'm going to say pet's name. And for the dropdown, I'm going to say species. And for options, it will just be an array of cats and dogs to choose from. And that should give me a good drop-down menu. I'll add one more form group here. Copy this one and overwrite the checkboxes. And I'll say pets age. Enter age here. And the type will be a number. Now here, of course, all of these V models I need to update. So I'm going to make a new data variable here. I'm going to call it form data. And it's going to be an object that's going to model all of my different form inputs. So I'm going to have formdata.name, which will start as an empty string. And I'll just give age a default of 0 for right now. And species, I'm going to say is null. And let me update these here. So form.age, form.species, and name is fine. So I also need to update this to form data instead of just form data, and one more, form data. So our form should be functional all the way until submit right now. Let me just try it in the browser. I have the add new pet button and it's not toggling the form. So let's see in the Vue JS DevTools, in app, in the home component, show pet form doesn't switch to true ever. So let me say true here. And it does show the pet form. Now I know where the error is happening. If I go back to my code, I can see that this toggle pet form is never being called because I forgot to add it to the button. So I'm just going to do an add click here. Say toggle pet form. That should work. Back in the browser, refresh, and now it toggles on and off. Great. Let's hook up the submit button. In the JavaScript here, I'm going to import another Vuex helper called map actions. And this works in the same way as map state. To do this, we need to add map actions to methods. Now the reason why we add the actions to the methods and the state to computed is that we are watching for changes to state and we're not watching for changes to these static methods. They're just functions for us to call so that we can get state updated. So now I'm going to pass in an array and my action was called add pet. So I'm mapping that to my methods and now I'm going to call it from handle submit. And I can do that by just saying this dot add pet and then passing it the payload. So the payload is an object that I'm going to create here. So const payload equals this object, and the payload should have the species, and then it will have a pet object with things like the name and age. Now to get this information, I'm going to pull it off of data here, so the form data object, and I can do that by using this syntax. I'm going to pull species, age, and name off of this dot form data, and I put this in the wrong spot, so take this outside of that object, and now here I should be getting all of my right information, passing it as an object with species and pet as the payload, and then this will go into the actions here as my custom payload that I'm passing through to a mutation, and the mutation will have species and pet pulled off payload, so I can update state.cats or state.dogs and push the new pet. Let me see if this is working in the browser. I'll refresh this, add pet, let me add Bosco, and is a cat, submit. Okay, so if you notice the page refresh here, it was pretty quick, but it's not actually going to submit the form correctly because of that refresh. It's handling it in the default way when it's supposed to be submitting a form to a server, but of course that's not the functionality that we want. So I'm going to come back here, go to home, and now for our submit handler, I'm just going to add .prevent. And if you remember, this modifier is just like calling event.prevent default, just like you would in a regular function submit handler, but this is a shortcut that Vue has. So I'm going to come back to the browser, and now if I add a new pet, cat, the age is 22, and I'm going to submit this. And I think it's submitted correctly, but of course we're not clearing out the form after, so there's no feedback whether or not it's submitted. So let's go to cats, and we see a cat is appended to the table. Awesome. Now I just want to clean it up a bit and clear out the form when I'm done. I'm going to see, nope, it's clear now, but I wanted to clear right after I submit to give some user feedback. So if I come down here, I'm going to add something to reset the form after submit. So I'm going to say that this dot form data equals an object, and I'm going to reset it to exactly what it was before. These. Okay, now let me try to submit another pet. This time I'm going to submit a dog. 12, submit, and now it's resetting the form after it's submitted. And let me go to dogs here, and it correctly added the dog. Of course, there's a lot of other things we could add, but that's basically how Vuex works, is that you'll call an action from a component, and actions are asynchronous. And then from the action, whenever you're done doing what you want to do with the action, you call a mutation, and then the mutation updates state. And then whatever components are listening to state, because you're mapping the state to a computed function, those components will update in the DOM where it's needed. Now I want to show you real quick how getters work. There is actually another object that goes into the store, and it's called getters. So getters are like computed properties, but for your Vuex store. What does that mean? Perhaps you want to pull state into a component, but you want to modify what the component receives while you're pulling it. So it won't actually update state, but it will get back something that you want out of state. For example, we could count how many animals we have in our arrays in a getter, and then call that getter from everywhere we want to get the number of animals. So let's just create that real quick. I need to first create a getters object and a getters file, and it's the same as the other Vuex objects. So I'm going to export default in object here, and I'm going to call it animals count, which is a function, and here I'm going to have access to the state, and I can do whatever I want with the state before I return it to a component. Another arrow function. And if I want to get the total count of both cats and dogs, I could say something like state.cats.length plus state.dogs.length. And now to use these getters, I need to put it in one of my components. So I'm actually going to put this in the home component, and I'm going to put it just above the button. So I'm going to say animals count here. Of course, I need to map this. So there's another method called mapGetters, and I need this inside the computed because we're watching for changes on this. So I'll put mapGetters here, and this is using the spread operator as well. So that's a method with an array, the same format, and that will be animals count. Let me make sure I got that right. Animals count, perfect. Let's see if that works in the browser. If I go home, and I see I have 8, which is exactly how many animals I have because I have 4 cats and 4 dogs. But of course, pulling this from a getter didn't update state at all. It's just modifying how state is seen by a component. So I can run whatever function I want. Now, one common thing that you'll be using getters for is for filtering. So I can say something like get all cats. Now to do this, I'm going to need to create another array here, and this time I'm going to call it pets. So instead of cats and dogs in separate arrays, I'm going to give it one array, cats and dogs. If you haven't seen this syntax before, it's basically so that the array is flat, because if I just put cats and dogs without the 3 dots behind each, it would come out being all of the cats in one array and then all of the dogs in another nested array. So this is an easy and nice way to make all of the pets together in one array. So now that all of the pets are together here, I'm going to need to add what species they are inside the data to differentiate between the two. So I'm going to add species is cat, and I'm going to copy this and just paste it in all of these. I have one extra comma. And I would put this in dogs too, but just to show the getter example, I'm going to say get all cats will be return state dot pets, which will have both cats and dogs in it, and then dot filter. The filter method takes a function which will give us each pet one at a time and allow us to return just the pets we want in an array. So I'm only going to include the pets in the array where pet dot species equals cat. And now I should be able to use this get all cats getter, well, once I add state from my component, and I'm going to do that here. So I'm going to say, add another variable, get all cats, and I don't want to print out all of those objects, so I'm just going to put length to see how many cats is returned. And of course I need to add that inside my getters, get all cats, and now I should be able to call this from the DOM and check how many cats are returned versus the total number of pets. Back in the browser, I see it's getting the correct number of cats versus all pets. In case you can't see, there are 4 cats and 8 total pets. That's basically how getters work. It's used a lot for filtering or making changes to what's going to be rendered on the DOM. You can do a lot of different things with getters. You could also pass in other getters. So here I could actually call another getter inside this getter because Vuex gives me that as a second argument. This whole system is pretty simple once you've practiced it a little bit. I want to show another thing that I think would be helpful in a production application or as you're building your personal projects. That is setting up Sass inside of a project. And this is how I generally do it in Vue. So I add a folder inside of source/assets called Sass. And then I have an index.sass file. And I make a couple folders inside of my Sass directory. So I have my components and my libraries and my global styles, which I usually call base. And then I import all of these files into my index. So I'll import first libraries and then base. And then I'll import components here. So inside of the libraries folder, I might have mixins or material design or whatever other Sass files I want to import here. I can also import CSS files. I just rename them .scss because any valid CSS can also be used inside of .scss files, which is a type of Sass file. I just prefer to use indented syntax without curly braces or semicolons, and there are some extra shortcuts that you get with the indented syntax that I like. So after the libraries, the base files, I'll generally have something called variables.sass. And now this underscore is just a convention in Sass to mean that this file is imported into another file and not compiled as an individual file. So I have a variables file, and here I might do something like set my fonts as a variable. So I could set, let's say, main font and set that equal to, I'm not sure, Helvetica, if that's right, or whatever Google font that I've imported or any other font. And then sans serif, and do colors and padding and spacing. I'm just going to do maybe a blue color here, which could be 00034. And then you get the idea. You can put pretty much anything you want to be able to use in other parts of your application, and then you can just change it in one place. And this also makes it easy if you're doing different themes or letting a user choose their theme in their application. You just save all the different themes here and then attach them to a class and toggle that class dynamically from the JavaScript inside your Vue components. So now that I have some variables here, I can import this into my main Sass file, and with an @import, I'll say base/variables, and I don't need the underscore or the .sass on the end. It's going to look for either .sass or .scss files. And I think this makes the file look really clean. It's easy to look through a whole list of these. Now in the components, let me just pull up one component here. Let's say a view and my home view. And it starts out with the class home, but generally I don't think this is descriptive enough. So I usually call things like home view container or something like that in my project. And this is a wrapper class so that I can contain my nested classes and they don't affect other parts of the application. Because my global styles will all be in base, but each component that I make will also have its own styles. So I'm going to create a new style file for the home component, and then I put this wrapper class, and then any other classes that I want to affect the home component, I'll put nested inside of here. Just so you can see the nesting, I'll put 4 spaces instead of 2, which is generally what I use whenever I'm doing something like Python or Sass using indented syntax. because it makes the indentation easier to see. So now I'm just going to say color and use my color variable that I'm also importing into my index file. So now in components, I will import base/home. And now I have styles that are specific only to the home component. So how do we get these styles to apply to the components? You have to import them into the main.js file. So right below where I have these Bootstrap files imported, I'm also going to import from the assets folder, sass and index.sass. And now that should apply all of my sass files to my project, because if you remember when we created this project from the Vue CLI, we chose sass as the preprocessor. So the Vue CLI set up all of the sass processing for us and being able to compile it to CSS and things like that, which makes it really easy to use sass inside of projects. So it's complaining about this @import statement. So let me add components here. And now it's working fine, although the text is not turning blue. Let me see why that is. If I go to inspect element, it is actually blue, but it's just so hard to tell because it's not a very bright color. So let me change that to a brighter color. If I go into the variables, and I'm just going to change this to any color, not necessarily blue, just so it shows up. I have no idea what color this is. Okay, purple. And it doesn't affect any other page here because I am using a namespace in Sass, so it only affects anything inside of this class, which is specific to the div wrapper around home.view. So hopefully that makes sense. I do make usually one of these components for every single of my component files, and any global styles I'll put inside various styles in the base directory. So that's enough about Sass. I just wanted to show you how I usually set up a Sass project. This code will all be online if you want to see it. I want to change one more thing that feels a little bit dirty about this project, and that is to pull this table out into its own component. In my components, I'm just going to create a new file called pettable.vue, and I'm going to use this as a table inside both cats and dogs. So to start this, I'm going to just steal this template, put it here, and to make it unique for each one, we're going to need to pass in some props to this component from both our cats and dogs views. So I need to have props on my default object. I'm going to make this an object and say, first of all, I think we're going to need a species, which will be a string. And then here I can replace this with species. It's going to be lowercase. And here I'll replace this with pets because we'll pass either cats or dogs as pets. And pets will be in array. And then here I also want to use species to dynamically pass that. And I think that's it really. We just have to import pets table. Let's import it into cats first. So I'll import pets or pet table from @components/ pettable.vue, and I need to set it as a component I'm going to use in my DOM here. Components pet table. Not sure if I mentioned this previously in the video, but using pet table as a component here, I can do this in two different ways. I'm going to get rid of this, and I can use it capitalized, or Vue gives me another default way to do it, which is kebab case. by default to make it more HTML-like, I could do that. Generally, the recommended way that I've heard from members of the core team and others, and also from using it myself, is to just keep it capitalized, and that lets you see the difference between the custom components that you create and the other HTML tags like div. So I'm going to be passing in this species here, and I know the species is cats, so I don't have to do anything else to that. And I'm also calling for the pets or the cats, which I need to pass in. And I have that array here mapped through computed, so I'm going to pass that in using vbind as pets, pass in the cats array. Of course, this is kind of confusing because these have the same name, but this one is an array because we're using vbind, so Vue is looking for a variable, so it's actually pulling this variable cats array off of computed and sending it in as pets. Now species, we're not using vbind here, so it's just static, so it's the string cats. And let's see how this works. If we go to the browser and go to cats, it's still working the same way. So I'm going to copy this for dogs. Go here into the dogs component and get rid of all this table stuff here, except we're going to be passing dogs in for both of these. And then we need to pull in the pet table component from here and also add that component so that we can use it in the DOM. And I'm going to add it here, and then it should work still for both cats and dogs. Refresh, and it works for dogs just as well. And we can still see that we have the correct number of both being pulled in. So that's all for this Vue tutorial. If you're interested in going further with Vue, let me know and I might make a more advanced intro to Vue in the future. Here are the resources I think are most helpful for getting into Vue. First, there's the State of Vue JS, which is a yearly report put out by Evan You, who's the creator of Vue. He gives lots of great talks about how the project and library are evolving every year, and you can find those for free on YouTube. Another resource I highly recommend is somebody who's a senior Vue developer called the Jared Wilkert. He live streams various tutorials, mostly about Vue, every Thursday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Time in the USA. He's a really great teacher, so I highly recommend jumping into some of those chats and asking him questions. Then there's one of my favorite people on the Vue JS core team, Sarah Drasner. Now, I didn't cover animations in this tutorial, but she's actually the best person to talk about those types of things. Vue JS has a lot of great built-in animation features. I'm going to link a video of a talk she gave on Vue animations that I think is really good. One last thing I recommend for getting into Vue is checking out the Views on Vue podcast. You can find it on DevChat TV or on Overcast or any of your other favorite podcasting applications. Thanks so much for watching this whole tutorial. I know it's kind of long, but I hope you got something out of it. If you have any questions or feedback from me, you can find me on Twitter at Gwen_Faraday or shoot me an email at gwenfaraday@pm.me. I also have a YouTube channel called Coding with Gwen that I'm going to be starting back up here soon, and this is kind of a kickoff video for that. So if you are interested in more of these types of videos, you can check me out there. Thanks.